You're listening to the RetireCoast podcast, where money, business, and lifestyle come together. Join us each week as we explore smarter financial planning, starting and growing businesses, and building the life you want at every stage, from millennials and Gen X to today's retirees.
Welcome back to another installment of our 250th anniversary series, where we discuss situations and events that took place in around 1776 that are unique, things that most people aren't aware of, that aren't necessarily taught in school. We want to bring these to you right in the forefront so that during this time of the anniversary celebration that'll happen in 2026, we want you to be aware of what happened in 1776. Now, this article here today is, and a podcast, is about starting a business in 1776. So for those of you that are starting a business in 2026, you can possibly relate to a number of things that would have been common back in 1776, and then many things which are not. So this struggle to start a business back then, even in the absence of regulations and all of the trappings that we have today, the taxes, etc., there was still some difficulties that I think you'll find absolutely fascinating in this dialogue that you're going to hear. And we set it up as a dialogue because two people talking back and forth about this can explore a lot of details. And it's based upon an article that I have written, which is published at RetireCoast.com, which you can go into. It's a lengthy article. It's about 14,000 words, which is very long even for me. But it's so full of graphics that you can see and details and audio and visuals. It's a great article, and this podcast is built on that article, and you'll hear these two individuals talking about it here. So please listen, and then I'll catch up with you at the end. Thank you.
Imagine for a second that your entire family's future, and I mean everything you own, relies on a single fragile wooden ship.
Right.
A ship that is crossing the Atlantic Ocean right in the middle of hurricane season.
Just a terrifying thought.
It is. And you don't have, like, some insurance policies sitting in a filing cabinet.
No, not at all.
You have no corporate shield, no LLC protecting your personal bank account.
You're totally exposed.
Exactly.
Yeah. If
that ship sinks or, if privateers intercept it off the coast, you don't just lose your job.
Right. It's not just a bad quarter for the company.
Yeah, the creditors actually come to your door. They take your house. They take your tools.
They'll take your family's livestock.
And if all of that still isn't enough to cover the debt, you are thrown into a freezing, disease-ridden debtor's prison.
Oh.
And you just sit there until your destitute family can somehow buy your way out.
Which, I mean, how are they supposed to do that when everything was just seized?
Right. It's an impossible situation.
Yeah.
But welcome to the reality of entrepreneurship in 1776.
It's just wild.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because today, for this deep dive, we are stepping into a time machine.
We really are.
We have this massive, incredibly detailed source article from RetireCoast. It's titled, Starting a Business in 1776 versus Today. Entrepreneurs Before LLCs.
It's a fantastic piece of research.
It really is. So our mission today is to strip away the powdered wigs.
Right. Get past the romanticized painting.
Exactly. We want to figure out what it was practically mechanically like to be a business owner during the founding of America.
And the contrast between that brutal reality you just described and our modern environment, it's just staggering.
Oh, totally.
Because today, forming a business is, it's largely a bureaucratic exercise.
It's paperwork.
Right. Sit down with a cup of coffee, you open a web browser, pay a small fee to your state secretary of state, and boom.
Within hours, you have an LLC.
Exactly. A limited liability company.
Right.
And that LLC creates this magical, invisible wall between what the business owes and what you personally own.
It's a safety net.
A massive one. But in 1776, that invisible wall simply did not exist for the average person.
Which feels completely wild to a modern ear.
It really does.
Because if you are a business owner listening to this right now, you are probably wrestling with, tax software.
Or state compliance forms.
Yeah, or agonizing over workers' comp insurance. And it is so easy to look back at the colonial era and think, wow, 1776 sounds like an absolute paradise.
Right, like, oh, no OSHA, no payroll taxes.
Exactly, no endless red tape. But the reality we are diving into is that while they lacked our modern bureaucratic hurdles, the trade-off was catastrophic.
Yeah, a landscape completely defined by life-altering personal risk.
So let's talk about that paradox.
Yeah.
Because that perceived freedom was actually a terrifying financial tightrope.
It really was. According to the Yale Avalon Project records, which detail colonial legal structures, the formal corporate charter was incredibly rare.
And a corporate charter is basically the 18th century equivalent of an LLC.
Yes, essentially. It's the legal mechanism that protects investors from personal ruin. But colonial governments and legislative bodies, they viewed the corporate structure with deep, deep suspicion.
Really? Why were they suspicious of it?
Well, they believed that granting a group of people limited liability was this special privilege, and they thought it should only be granted to entities serving a massive public interest.
Okay, so we are talking about major infrastructure projects.
Exactly, like a group wealthy enough to build a toll bridge.
Or charter a university.
Right. Or perhaps establish a massive trading enterprise or an early bank. The state had to see a definitive public benefit to grant that legal shield.
So for the ordinary entrepreneur, the local baker firing up their ovens or the blacksmith importing iron.
The corporation was completely out of reach.
Wow.
Yeah. The overwhelming majority of the colonial economy was driven by sole proprietors and these informal handshake partnerships.
I want to really dig into the mechanics of what that actually means on like a Tuesday afternoon for a colonial tradesman.
Okay, let's do it.
Because modern entrepreneurs often complain about the heavy safety harness of red tape. And fair enough, filling out compliance forms is a headache.
It definitely is.
But in 1776, you were walking a tightrope without that harness and totally without a net. Let's say I am a printer in Philadelphia.
Okay, good example.
And I have spent an absolute fortune importing a heavy printing press from London.
Which would have been incredibly expensive.
Right. And then my shop catches fire, which, let's be honest, was incredibly common in cities built entirely of wood.
Oh, absolutely. Wood buildings, open flames everywhere. Fires were a constant threat.
So the press is completely destroyed. But I still owe the London merchant for that press. What happens next?
So the legal concept operating here is unlimited liability. The debt doesn't just disappear because your means of income disappeared.
Even though the press is literally ashes.
Doesn't matter. Your creditors have the absolute legal right to pursue you for the entire balance.
So what does that look like?
The local sheriffs would arrive at your home. They would literally inventory your physical possessions.
Like walking through my living room making a list.
Exactly. Your furniture, your dining ware, your wife's spinning wheel.
The deed to the property.
Yes, all of it. It could all be seized and auctioned off to satisfy the debt.
That is just total unmitigated ruin. There's no concept of, the business went bankrupt, but I am personally okay.
None whatsoever. And it gets worse. If the liquidation of your personal assets wasn't enough to satisfy the creditors, you faced debtor's prison.
Which is just terrifying.
It was. This wasn't a modern bankruptcy proceeding, right? Where a judge restructuring your debt allows you to keep a primary residence and start over.
Right, Chapter 11 or whatever.
Yeah, there was no Chapter 11. You were physically incarcerated until the debt was paid.
Which is such a horrifying paradox.
Yeah.
Because how are you supposed to work to pay off the debt while you were sitting in a prison cell?
You can't.
Yeah.
You were entirely reliant on family or friends or maybe a wealthy patron taking pity on you and paying it off.
So does this mean colonial entrepreneurs were just naturally braver than we are today? Or did they simply have no other choice? I mean, who volunteers for that level of exposure?
This raises an important question, actually. It's about how humans manage and mitigate risk in the absence of a formal legal structure.
Right.
Because I don't believe they possess some inherent superhuman bravery. Rather, their environment forced them to construct entirely different safety nets.
Okay, what kind of nets?
Well, because there was no LLC shield and obviously no modern credit scoring system, the only net you could build was your personal reputation.
Ah, reputation was literally currency.
It was the absolute foundation of your economic survival. Think about it. If you operated in a tight-knit community in, say, Rhode Island or Virginia, your customers, your suppliers, your creditors...
They all knew you personally.
Yes. They saw you at church. They saw you in the tavern. So if you produced poor quality goods or if you were slow to pay a merchant for a shipment of flowers... Word spreads instantly. A damaged reputation ruined you financially long before credit scores or online reviews ever existed. You survived based entirely on community trust.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
But the physical reality of losing everything you own it really brings up the question of who was actually subjecting themselves to this.
Right.
Because when we picture the Founding Fathers, the image ingrained in our heads is like a group of aristocratic politicians.
Yeah, guys in powdered wigs.
Exactly. Standing in these grand sunlit rooms in Philadelphia, debating Enlightenment philosophy and signing the Declaration of Independence.
It's a traditional historical painting.
Right. But the source material completely flips that image on its head. These men were the original startup founders.
They absolutely were. If you look at the occupational breakdown of the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, it is incredibly revealing.
What are the numbers?
Between 20% and 23% of them were directly engaged as merchants or printers.
Wow. Over a fifth.
Yes. And another 41 to 43% were lawyers or jurists.
And I imagine back then lawyers were mostly handling commercial stuff.
Exactly. They were handling the complex commercial litigation of the day, drafting those complicated credit agreements.
And if you add in the plantation owners and the large-scale farmers, the number of actual business operators becomes the vast majority of the room.
Without a doubt. We hear farmer and we tend to think of like a guy with a pitchfork in a small field.
Right.
But in 1776, a large-scale plantation was a massive, highly complex agricultural enterprise.
They were managing huge workforces.
Huge workforces, dealing with international supply chains, monitoring fluctuating commodity prices in Europe, and navigating really complex debt structures.
So figures like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, they were effectively CEOs of sprawling, diversified enterprises.
That's the perfect way to look at it. Washington wasn't just growing tobacco. He operated a commercial fishery on the Potomac River.
Really? A fishery?
Yes. And a grist mill, a whiskey distillery, and a massive weaving operation.
That's a serious portfolio.
It is. And the skills required to build a new nation from scratch. You know, understanding logistics, securing financing without a central bank, managing catastrophic risk.
Right, and long-term strategic planning.
Exactly. Those are the exact same skills honed by running a complex business in a completely hostile environment.
The overlap is undeniable. I really want to look at some specific examples from the RetireCoast text, because the mechanics of how these guys operated are just fascinating. Let's start with Benjamin Franklin.
Oh, Franklin is a perfect example.
Right, because the mythology paints him as this statesman, an inventor, the quirky guy flying a kite in a thunderstorm.
The guy on the $100 bill.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, his wealth and influence came from being an absolute media mogul.
He was. Franklin is the perfect case study of a colonial entrepreneur scaling a business.
How so?
Well, he didn't just run a single local newspaper in Philadelphia. He actually built one of the earliest franchising-style networks in the colonies.
Okay, wait. How did that actually work in an era where communication moved at the speed of a horse? You can't just set up a Slack channel with your regional managers.
No, you definitely can't. He leveraged the apprenticeship system and his own capital. So when Franklin had a highly skilled journeyman printer working for him, he wouldn't just keep them in Philadelphia.
You would send them out.
Yeah. He would identify a growing colonial town that lacked a printer, say somewhere in South Carolina or New York.
Okay.
And Franklin would actually purchase the printing press and the incredibly expensive lead type.
Because the journeyman could never afford that.
Exactly. The capital expenditure was massive. So Franklin fronts the money, sends his journeyman down there to set up a new shop.
And what does Franklin get out of it?
In exchange, Franklin took a 1/3 cut of the profits for a set period, usually around 6 years.
Wow. He functioned like a modern venture capitalist and a franchisor combined.
He really did. He created a syndication network. This allowed him to distribute his own publications, control massive amounts of advertising space across different colonies.
Well, because he owned the presses.
Right. And he could secure lucrative government printing contracts up and down the eastern seaboard. He was truly building an empire of ink and paper.
That is just brilliant. And then there is James Hunter. This story completely shifted my perspective on colonial industry.
The Rappahannock Forge.
Yes. The text talks about his operation in Virginia. He scaled up this massive physical operation to produce muskets, swords, camp kettles, heavy iron tools.
A massive industrial complex.
Right. And we think of the startup as this very modern Silicon Valley invention where a guy in a hoodie scales software from his garage.
Yeah, that's the modern trope.
But weren't colonial operators like Hunter doing the exact same thing, just with molten iron and charcoal instead of code and servers?
The parallels in the entrepreneurial psychology are striking. Hunter's operation eventually employed hundreds of workers.
Hundreds. In 1776.
Yes. He was running a complex industrial startup before the Industrial Revolution had even firmly taken root in America.
Okay, walk me through the logistical nightmare of running a massive forge back then. Because if I am running a modern manufacturing startup today, I have global supply chain software.
Right, you have just-in-time logistics.
Exactly. What is Hunter dealing with?
He is dealing with a geographic and infrastructural nightmare. I mean, just to run a forge of that scale, you need massive quantities of raw iron ore.
Which has to come from somewhere.
It has to be mined and then transported via horse-drawn wagons over unpaved, deeply rutted dirt roads.
Roads that probably turn into impassable mud when it rains.
Exactly. And then you need enormous amounts of charcoal to fire the furnaces. That requires teams of woodcutters basically clearing entire forests and slowly burning the timber.
And you have to hire and manage all of this highly skilled labor. Blacksmiths, carpenters, wheelwrights.
In an economy where skilled labor is incredibly scarce.
And let me guess, he has to finance this entire operation without a modern commercial bank.
You hit the nail on the head. Hunter had to coordinate all of this raw material, secure the financing, and produce a finished product, say, a massive order of camp kettles for the military.
All while dealing with the constant threat of, the physical infrastructure burning down.
Oh, floods destroying his water wheels. It was constant, relentless problem solving.
The text explicitly compares these colonial titans, merchants like Robert Morris or industrialists like Hunter, to modern billionaires. It specifically mentions Elon Musk.
It does, yes.
And when you look past the technology, the similarities in their DNA are striking. They share this incredibly high-risk tolerance, a mindset geared toward massive infrastructure expansion.
And the ability to identify economic opportunities before the systems are even in place to support them.
Yes. The fundamental difference is simply the access to scale. A modern billionaire can build a software platform that serves 3 billion people globally in a matter of years.
While colonial entrepreneurs were strictly bound by the physical limitations of geography, the speed of sailing ships, the bandwidth of handwritten correspondence.
But the underlying psychology, that willingness to build something entirely new without a safety net, is identical.
Absolutely identical.
Which is wild. And that lack of clear systems is a perfect pivot to the most chaotic part of this entire era. We have to talk about the money.
Oh, the money. It's a mess.
We are venturing into the wild west of colonial finance. Today, if you want to fund a business, the pathways are pretty clear. You pitch a venture capital firm, you apply for an SBA loan through a local bank.
Or you just put $10,000 on a business credit card.
Exactly. How on earth did you fund a startup in colonial America when commercial banking essentially did not exist?
The financial landscape was absolute chaos. The Federal Reserve History Archives detail a colonial currency system that was so fragmented and unstable, it is honestly a miracle any commerce happened at all.
So if you were a colonial merchant, you didn't have a checking account?
No, you had to navigate a terrifyingly complex, mixed economy.
I really want to visualize this. Okay, let's say I am a merchant running a dry goods store in Boston. A customer walks in to buy a plow, some imported tea, and a bolt of cloth. How are they paying me?
Okay, so they might pay you with a mix of Spanish silver coins, the famous pieces of 8.
Wait, Spanish silver? Why not British money?
Because the British government actually restricted the export of British sterling to the colonies, so Spanish silver was heavily circulated.
So they are literally handing me foreign silver.
Yes, and if the item costs less than a full coin, they might literally chop the silver coin into 8 triangular pieces, hence pieces of 8, and hand you 3 pieces.
That is wild. I'm just picturing a guy with a chisel at the checkout counter.
It's basically what happened, but that's just the hard currency. The customer might also hand you colonial paper currency.
Okay, what is that?
Well, because there was a chronic shortage of silver, individual colonies like Massachusetts or Rhode Island printed their own paper money to fund government operations.
Okay, seems logical.
But this paper money was highly unstable. It suffered from massive depreciation and rampant counterfeiting.
So a Rhode Island pound might be worth drastically less than a Pennsylvania pound.
Precisely. And the value fluctuates wildly from month to month.
Oh my God.
And to make matters even worse, merchants still kept their accounting ledgers in the abstract units of British pounds, shillings, and pence.
Wait, so they are physically accepting Spanish silver pieces, depreciated colonial paper,
and perhaps a barrel of salted pork in a barter arrangement to make up the difference.
And they have to write all of that down as British pounds in the ledger.
Yes.
Just imagine the mental gymnastics required at the checkout counter. You are constantly calculating exchange rates between foreign silver, unstable local paper, and physical commodities, all while trying to record it in a totally different unit of account.
It's dizzying.
It makes modern inflation look like a walk in the park.
It really made long-term financial planning nearly impossible. I mean, if you agree to be paid in 6 months for a large shipment of goods, you have no idea what the paper currency you receive will actually be worth when the time comes.
Which brings us back to the role of trust, and specifically the story of Robert Morris,
the financier of the Revolution.
Exactly. Through aggressive shipping and international trade, Morris amassed a fortune that historians estimate would be equivalent to a modern billionaire. The text says somewhere between $1 billion and $20 billion today.
Yes, Morris was a master of high-risk financial entrepreneurship. He leveraged his enormous personal shipping empire and complex international trade networks to secure loans from France and the Netherlands.
Because America was broke.
Completely broke. He effectively bankrolled the Continental Army out of his own pocket and through his own personal credit.
He essentially acted as a one-man central bank for a country that didn't have one yet.
That's exactly what he did.
But the irony of his life story, based on the text, is absolutely staggering. The guy who financed America's independence died, broke in debtor's prison.
He did, because of aggressive land speculation later in his life.
What does that tell us about the volatility of this era?
It perfectly illustrates that the lack of a legal safety net applied to everyone, regardless of their wealth or political connections.
Nobody was immune.
Nobody. Morris's downfall demonstrates the immense danger of the 18th century credit system. Because formal banks barely existed, the entire economy ran on merchant credit.
How did that actually work mechanically? If I am a local shopkeeper and I need inventory, but I don't have the cash, how do I get it?
You rely on a chain of trust.
A chain of trust.
Okay.
The local shopkeeper gets goods on credit from a regional merchant. The regional merchant gets goods on credit from a massive international merchant like Robert Morris.
Right.
And Morris gets his goods on credit from suppliers in London or Amsterdam. That entire chain is held together by handwritten letters of credit and personal reputation. It's an entire economy built on a gentleman's agreement.
And it is incredibly fragile. If rumors start circulating in the coffee houses and taverns that your merchant ships have sunk, or that you have over-leveraged yourself by buying up millions of acres of Western land.
Which is exactly what Morris did.
Exactly. When those rumors start, your creditors panic. They stop extending you credit and demand immediate payment.
And when Morris couldn't liquidate his vast land holdings fast enough to generate the hard cash, his creditors demanded.
The chain of trust snapped. In a world without bankruptcy protection, the sheriffs arrive, the assets are seized, and one of the wealthiest men in American history goes to a freezing prison cell.
It is a brutal, unforgiving system.
Yeah.
And it highlights how critical information was.
Yeah.
Because if your reputation dictates your access to capital, you have to control your reputation.
Absolutely.
How did you advertise your reliability? How did you market your goods without SEO, without social media algorithms, without targeted email newsletters?
Visibility was literally a matter of survival. But the speed of information was physically tethered to the environment.
Meaning what?
Meaning news could only travel as fast as a horse could gallop along a muddy post road, or a coastal sloop could sail from Boston to New York.
So if you are a merchant waiting on an incoming ship carrying valuable textiles from Europe, and you need to sell that inventory immediately to pay off your own creditors before they panic,
you have to let the public know the moment that ship hits the dock.
how do you do that?
You utilized a highly localized physical information highway. You paid the local printer to run advertisements in the weekly newspaper. You commissioned printed broadsides, which were large single-sheet posters.
Like flyers.
Yes, and handbills to be nailed up in public squares at church gathering places and marketplaces.
But the true center of colonial networking, the absolute hub of the 18th century information highway, was the tavern.
Oh, taverns were essential.
The text makes a fascinating point that we heavily misunderstand colonial taverns. We picture them just as rowdy bars where people drank ale.
Just a bunch of guys singing sea shanties.
Right. But they were actually the co-working spaces, the post offices, and the vital commercial networking centers of 1776.
They were the indispensable infrastructure of colonial business. Think about it. When a post rider arrived in a town, the tavern was their first stop.
So that's where the news hit first.
Exactly. Newspapers from other colonies were delivered there and often read aloud to the patrons because, not everyone could afford a subscription or even know how to read.
So if you are a business owner, you aren't just going to the tavern to relax after a hard day. You were going there to gather intelligence.
It was a business meeting.
You are listening for news of a terrible storm that might have delayed a competitor's shipment. You are negotiating contracts over a bowl of punch. You are establishing your reputation by physically being present in the commercial hub of the town.
Taverns functioned as informal commodities exchanges. A merchant could sit in the tap room of the city tavern in Philadelphia and broker a deal for hundreds of barrels of flour or secure cargo space on an outgoing ship.
Taverns were basically the LinkedIn and Slack channels of their day.
That's a great comparison.
If you wanted a message to go viral, you didn't optimize a video algorithm. You walked into the busiest tavern in town, bought a round of drinks, and made sure every merchant in the room knew that your blacksmith forge was fully operational and taking massive orders.
What's fascinating here is that we are actually observing a cyclical trend in modern business that mirrors this exact dynamic.
Really? How so?
Well, today we have infinite digital reach, but we are suffering from profound digital burnout. The sheer volume of online noise and global competition makes it incredibly difficult for a small business to stand out purely through digital marketing.
Right, because anyone can buy a Facebook ad. It doesn't signal trust anymore. It just signals that you have a marketing budget.
Exactly the problem. As a result, many modern local businesses are returning to a hyper-local community trust model.
Like what?
Think about the modern local coffee shop, the independent bookstore, the neighborhood craft brewery. These are serving the exact same function as the Colonial tavern. Oh, that makes so much sense.
Modern entrepreneurs are finding that face-to-face networking, hosting community events, and establishing deep physical roots in their immediate geography often yields a much stronger, more resilient customer base than attempting to capture fleeting digital attention.
We're craving the tavern dynamic again. We want to do business with people we can actually look in the eye.
We really are.
But there is another aspect of colonial marketing that highlights the physical limitations of the era, and that is visual branding.
Yes, to the signage.
Because today, branding is incredibly complex. It's brand voice, color palettes, digital user experience. In 1776, it was brutally literal.
It had to be literal because of the audience. While literacy rates in places like New England were relatively high compared to Europe, they were still varied across the colonies.
Especially in certain demographics.
Right, especially among the working classes, immigrants, and sailors who populated the waterfront districts.
Yeah.
You couldn't rely on a clever, text-heavy storefront sign.
You needed something universally recognizable. Therefore, businesses relied heavily on three-dimensional, carved, and painted signs hanging above their doors.
What kind of iconography?
It was very standardized. A tavern might hang a painted board featuring a red lion or a crown or a golden fleece.
So you'd say, "Meet me at the Red Lion."
Exactly. Or if a mariner needed a new compass, they didn't look for a sign reading navigational instruments. They looked for the shop with a massive wooden quadrant hanging outside. A bootmaker hung a giant painted boot. It was physical, spatial branding.
And if you wanted to move beyond the physical sign and reach the affluent, literate merchant class who were reading the newspapers, you ran into a major bottleneck.
The printers.
Right. The printers were the absolute gatekeepers of written commercial flow. If you wanted to run an ad or publish a shipping schedule, you had to negotiate with Benjamin Franklin's printing press or whoever held the local monopoly on ink and paper.
The printer dictated the flow of commercial information.
Which leads us to a massive question. We have explored the terrifying risks, the chaotic finance, the physical marketing. But how did an entrepreneur actually learn how to run the business in the first place?
The education piece.
Today, the path to acquiring business knowledge is completely frictionless.
The democratization of knowledge is perhaps the single starkest difference between the colonial economy and today.
I mean, if you want to start an e-commerce brand right now, the barriers to entry are practically zero. You can watch a series of YouTube tutorials, take a specialized online course, or join a digital community.
Like the RetireCoast Business Builder membership mentioned in the source material.
Exactly. You can download accounting software that automatically categorizes your expenses. You can use platforms that handle all your state tax compliance automatically. You have the accumulated business knowledge of the entire world accessible from a smartphone in your pocket.
It's unprecedented. But in 1776, business knowledge was closely guarded, proprietary, and agonizingly slow to acquire.
You couldn't just read a book on how to run a commercial forge.
No, you had to endure the apprenticeship system.
Let's break down the mechanics of an apprenticeship, because it wasn't just an internship where you shadowed a boss for a few months.
Oh, far from it.
It was a legally binding, multi-year surrender of your life.
It was a deeply structured paradigm of workforce development and education. A family would formally sign a legal document called an indenture, binding their child, usually a young boy around the age of 12 to 14, to a master craftsman for a period of up to 7 years.
7 years. And the master isn't just a boss. They effectively take over the role of the parent.
Legally and practically. The master was obligated to provide housing, food, clothing, and moral instruction.
And in exchange?
In exchange, the apprentice worked for absolutely no wages, offering their labor while slowly being taught the secrets of the trade.
And the daily reality of that labor was grueling. If you are apprenticed to a printer, you weren't immediately entrusted with laying out the front page of the newspaper.
Definitely not. You spend your first 2 years just doing heavy physical labor.
Like what? Sweeping.
You are sweeping the shop floor. You are hauling heavy reams of paper. You are spending hours physically beating the fibers of the paper to prepare it.
Wow.
You are mixing the toxic lead and antimony to cast type. You are boiling the foul-smelling linseed oil to make ink.
It was an immersion in the absolute foundational mechanics of the business.
Yes. You learned the physical toll of the labor before you ever learned the economics of the business.
Right.
But over those 7 years, the master slowly passed down not just the physical skills, like how to rapidly set tiny metal type letter by letter backwards, but the operational knowledge.
They learned how to actually run the shop.
Exactly. The apprentice learned how to manage difficult customers, how to negotiate with the paper mill for better rates, how to maintain the complex wooden machinery, and crucially, how to keep the ledger books.
And then what happens at the end of the 7 years?
By the end of the indenture, they were expected to produce a masterpiece, a final demonstration of their skill to prove they were ready to enter the economy as a journeyman.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Today, we have removed all of that friction. We have all the information in the world at our fingertips. You can learn the theory of how to balance a ledger or run a digital marketing campaign in an afternoon.
Sure.
Yet modern businesses still fail at incredibly high rates. Did the grueling 7-year Colonial apprenticeship actually create better, more resilient business owners because it forced them to learn operational discipline through pure survival?
I strongly believe that it provided a structural advantage that modern entrepreneurs often lack. While technology has gloriously democratized knowledge, it has simultaneously removed the mandatory training wheels phase of entrepreneurship.
We have removed the forced incubation period.
Precisely. In colonial times, by the time an apprentice finished their term, worked as a journeyman to save capital, and finally opened their own shop, they deeply, intrinsically understood customer service, pricing structures, production timelines, labor management, and purchasing.
They didn't just read about it.
No, they had internalized the operational discipline required to survive because they had lived it every day for a decade.
Today, because the software makes it so easy to launch a shiny website and declare yourself a CEO on social media, many modern entrepreneurs skip the boring foundational systems.
They vastly underestimate the importance of basic bookkeeping, understanding profit margins, and maintaining operational discipline. They focus on the product or the marketing, but the underlying machinery of the business is hollow.
And what happens when a crisis hits?
When the first major crisis hits a supply chain delay or a sudden drop in revenue, they lack the deeply ingrained resilience and system knowledge to navigate it, which often leads directly to failure.
It is the ultimate double-edged sword of the modern era. We have unmatched speed, but we lack the forced tempering of the iron.
Exactly.
And speaking of the people running these systems, we need to correct a massive historical blind spot that the source material brings up.
The role of women.
Yes. When we talk about colonial entrepreneurs, our minds immediately default to men. We picture the merchants in the taverns, the blacksmiths at the forge.
The founding fathers.
Right. But the hidden entrepreneurs of 1776 were the women, and the colonial economy was fundamentally a family enterprise.
The reality on the ground was profoundly different from the legal paper trail. The structure of the colonial economy blurred the lines entirely between family life, household production, and formal entrepreneurship.
Because the business wasn't a separate entity you drove to in an office park.
Right. The shop was usually on the ground floor of the home. It was a holistic family survival mechanism.
The source text points out that legal barriers severely restricted women from participating in the formal economy. I want to explain the mechanics of this because it wasn't just a cultural norm. It was deeply encoded law.
Yes.
The doctrine is called coverture, correct?
Yes, the legal doctrine of coverture.
Yeah.
Under English common law, which the colony has adopted, a married woman's legal identity was essentially subsumed by her husband upon marriage. She became a feme covert.
Meaning she was legally covered by him.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. This meant she could not legally own property in her own name, she could not control her own wages, she could not sue or be sued, and she could not sign a legally binding contract.
From a purely legal standpoint, the married woman was invisible in the commercial sphere.
Invisible. If she tried to sign a contract for inventory, it wouldn't hold up in court.
So legally, they are completely marginalized. But practically, mechanically, on the shop floor, they were running the show in a lot of places.
Absolutely. Because the business was in the home, the wife and daughters were deeply involved in the daily operations. And we see their incredible capability most clearly when the doctrine of coverture was lifted.
When was it lifted?
When a husband died. The widow achieved the status of feme sole, a single woman under the law. Suddenly, she had the legal right to own property and sign contracts.
And the historical record shows that they didn't just sell off the businesses, they took them over and expanded them.
The Smithsonian Institution and various historical archives are full of examples of widows inheriting and successfully operating incredibly complex enterprises.
Like what kind of enterprises?
We see them running bustling taverns, managing large boarding houses, operating retail mercantile stores, and continuing massive manufacturing operations.
The print shop example from the text is amazing. A Colonial printer dies, and his widow just steps up.
She doesn't miss a beat.
Think about what that entails. She isn't just sweeping up. She is suddenly managing the male apprentices, handling the complex finances and debt structures, negotiating paper contracts with mills, and maintaining the communication network for an entire colony.
She is deciding what political pamphlets get published during the build-up to a revolution.
It's incredible. And that is just the visible, formal business sector.
Right. We also have to account for the invisible home-based economy that was almost entirely driven by women.
The sewing, the baking, the candle making.
Yes. The massive weaving operations, the laundry services. These women were generating vital hard currency for the family, but it was rarely recorded in official ledgers.
We always picture the founding fathers making the grand deals. But behind the scenes, these businesses were heavily reliant on the invisible labor and strategic management of wives, daughters, and widows. Why does history so often erase them from the narrative of American capitalism?
It comes down to how history is recorded. History is written from the surviving paper trail.
And the paper trail was all men.
Because the formal legal charters, the property deeds, and the official contracts were by law restricted to men for most of the era, the primary sources simply omit the women who were actually balancing the ledgers and supervising the shop floors.
Their legal invisibility translated directly into historical invisibility.
But make no mistake, without the shared labor, the operational acumen, and the resilience of these women, the colonial economy would have entirely collapsed.
It really shatters the myth of the rugged, isolated, self-made man in colonial America. It was a family unit, a collective effort, pulling together simply to survive the tightrope.
It had to be.
And their survival skills were tested like never before when the ultimate market disruptor hit: war.
The American Revolution.
Right. It wasn't just a political event where people argued about taxation. It was a massive, seismic economic shock.
It was the definition of total market disruption. Before the hostilities broke out, the colonial economy was heavily, almost entirely, reliant on British imports.
Colonial merchants made their fortune selling finished goods manufactured in London or Birmingham.
Exactly. Local craftsmen constantly struggled to compete against cheap, mass-produced British materials.
They imported everything: high textiles, specialized tools, glass, paper, gunpowder.
But as tensions escalated, the colonies instituted non-importation agreements, basically boycotts of British goods. And when outright war began, those transatlantic supply chains were instantly severed.
British naval blockade.
Blockades, embargoes, and just the general chaos of wartime completely cut off the flow of imported goods.
It is exactly like what we experienced recently with global supply chain crashes during the pandemic.
Very similar dynamic.
When the massive container ships stop coming from overseas, you suddenly realize how vulnerable your entire economy is. You can't get microchips today. In 1776, you couldn't get sewing needles or iron rods.
But when those ships stop coming, the local makers suddenly hold all the cards.
This created a massive boom for domestic manufacturing, didn't it?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, periods of massive, terrifying uncertainty always create the greatest economic opportunities for those positioned to pivot.
So the sudden void of British imports created an immediate, desperate demand.
Huge demand. The newly formed Continental Army and the various colonial militias needed staggering amounts of supplies.
They needed camp kettles to feed soldiers, thousands of wagons, tons of leather goods for harnesses and shoes.
And most importantly, weapons and gunpowder.
And suddenly, the local blacksmiths, the gunsmiths, the weavers, and the foundry owners had to fill this massive void. Entrepreneurs like James Hunter at the Rappahannock Forge had to scale their operations exponentially overnight to meet the demand of a newly forming nation at war.
The pressure they were operating under is almost unimaginable.
I mean, you have a completely severed international supply chain. You are operating in an active war zone where the British Army might literally march through and burn your factory to the ground.
The paper currency you are being paid in by the Continental Congress is losing its value by the hour due to hyperinflation.
And you are trying to scale a massive manufacturing operation without any modern logistics, communication, or banking. And yet, they somehow did it. They built the physical foundation of the American economy while under fire.
The revolution was the ultimate catalyst. It forced the colonies to begin weaning themselves off British economic control. It planted the very first seeds for independent American industry.
They had no choice.
The entrepreneurs of that era realized that for the United States to actually survive as a political entity, it desperately needed its own manufacturing base, its own banking institutions, and its own robust internal trade relationships.
The war forced them to think beyond their local village commerce and start conceptualizing a vast national economy. So what does this all mean? As we bring this deep dive full circle, looking at everything from the lack of LLCs and the chaotic currency to the taverns and the invisible labor of women, what is the core takeaway for the modern listener?
The core thesis of this comparison is a tale of two very different types of friction. Starting a business in 1776 completely lacked the modern red tape that frustrates us today. There were no federal income tax forms, no OSHA compliance audits, no digital privacy regulations.
But the cost of that freedom was devastating personal risk. You were personally liable for every penny. You dealt with agonizingly slow and unreliable transportation, and you lacked any instant access to operational knowledge.
You walked a tightrope without a net.
Today, the paradigm has flipped.
Yeah.
We have the ultimate nets, LLCs to protect our homes, global logistics networks that can deliver raw materials in days, instantaneous digital knowledge, and incredible software tools that automate the hardest parts of running a business.
But we face a modern friction. Intense, overwhelming global competition, rapid technological obsolescence, complex cybersecurity threats, and massive regulatory complexity.
The tools of the trade have completely transformed. We have gone from balancing handwritten ledgers by candlelight and tracking sailing ships to deploying cloud software and leveraging artificial intelligence.
But the human traits required to actually succeed, the resilience to survive a crisis, the adaptability to pivot when a supply chain breaks, the character required to build genuine trust in your community, the willingness to solve massive problems, and the courage to take a calculated risk when everyone else is terrified. Those traits are exactly the same today as they were 250 years ago.
The entrepreneurial spirit is completely timeless.
It is the constant variable in the equation. The environment changes, the technology evolves at breakneck speed, but the psychology of the entrepreneur remains identical. They still wake up in the middle of the night worrying about cash flow, agonizing over customer trust, and plotting how to outmaneuver the competition.
Which leaves us with a fascinating final thought for you, the listener, to mull over as you go about your day.
Oh, this is a good one.
We have spent an hour talking about the raw grit of the colonial entrepreneur and the incredible, almost magical technological advantages we possess today. But imagine for a second that you were magically dropped into a noisy, smoke-filled colonial tavern in 1776.
Just completely transported.
You were equipped with just the business mindset and the strategic knowledge you have in your head right now. No smartphone, no internet, no LLC protection.
Just you and your wits.
Would your heavy reliance on modern digital systems be your downfall? Would you completely freeze without your spreadsheets, your automated marketing, and your instant data?
A lot of people would.
Or would your modern understanding of scalability, branding psychology, and identifying market inefficiencies allow you to build an absolute empire among the colonials? Think about what tools you might be taking for granted today and what core human skills you would actually have to rely on if the digital net was suddenly taken away.
A phenomenal question to ponder. It strips the concept of business down to its absolute, irreducible core.
Just remember, whether you are signing a ledger with a quill pen in 1776 or clicking a mouse today, the checklist might change. But the waters of entrepreneurship are always going to be muddy, and you still have to swim. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.
I hope that you found this podcast fascinating, as I did during the research to create it to begin with. I was really surprised, and particularly about the idea that the current president of the United States is not the first billionaire president. Actually, several of our early presidents, including Washington, would be considered billionaires in today's money. So there's apparently nothing new under the sun. We think maybe that everything's new for us, but it's really not. And these brilliant individuals who formed the Constitution and created our government and started the United States are to be credited for all of the hardship that they endured and the risks, the serious risks. Billionaires today take risks, but nothing like the risks that a billionaire would take in the 1776 time frame, or any other entrepreneur starting out a business. So if you're interested in starting a business, you might want to check out our business membership at RetireCoast.com, where we help you through the entire process. We have lots of tools, very sophisticated tools using AI now to help you make decisions on what you want to do, how you want to do it, and when you want to do it, along with many, many articles on every facet of starting a business, managing a business, selling a business, and that membership is very inexpensive. We have many, many free articles and also lots of free calculators on RetireCoast.com as well. So please come back and listen to more of our podcasts on this 250th series, which we're going to wrap up just after July, and we'll have a wrap-up podcast as well. Thank you for coming. We appreciate your time.